In this screencast lecture, we'll mainly learn about the Parol evidence rule, and more briefly about doctrines of contract interpretation. I've placed these rules on terms and interpretation in the performance category because they most often are used to determine whether one of the parties has performed or not. These doctrines are somewhat complex and can be unpredictable. I'll try to lay out the basics for you. The essential problem courts confront is whether to focus on determining what the parties truly intend, or to use more formal rules that will sometimes bar the use of relevant contextual evidence. We can best understand this conflict as creating a deep tension between text and context. We want to preserve the ability of parties to rely on informal understandings and context. But at the same time, formal rules provide greater certainty. Admitting contextual evidence can increase the risk of false claims or judicial errors of interpretation. The Parol evidence rule and its many formulations is one response to these competing concerns about text and context. It focuses on the problem of whether to recognize additional contractual terms even though the parties have signed a written contract. The rule excludes evidence of any prior or contemporaneous agreement when the parties have signed a final and exclusive written expression of their agreement. Bear in mind, though, that some Parol agreements fall outside of the Parol evidence rule. Most obviously, the rule doesn't bar proof of a collateral agreement with independent consideration. This exception is one aspect of the partial integration doctrine. Thus, a collateral agreement implies partial integration. For example, the buyer in Mitchell against Lath could have said, "I'll pay you $500 to tear down that ugly ice house. How about it?" If accepted, that would be a collateral agreement. In addition, the rule only bars evidence of prior or contemporaneous Parol agreements. Thus, it doesn't apply to modifications because that's a subsequent rather than prior or contemporaneous agreement. The parties also remain free to use contextual evidence to show that there was no agreement. This exception allows proof of duress, fraud, incapacity, illegality, and the like. Crucially, the Parol evidence rule also doesn't apply to contextual evidence that's offered to interpret the terms of an agreement. That means that parties seeking to prove an agreement that doesn't appear on the face of the written contract can sometimes evade the Parol evidence rule. They offer their contextual evidence for the purpose of interpreting the agreement rather than as proof of an additional term. Applying the Parol evidence rule turns on two related inquiries. First, we ask whether the agreement is partially or completely integrated. That is, did the parties intend to make it the final and exclusive statement of their bargain? Second, we ask whether the alleged oral agreement is consistent with the written terms of the contract. You can usefully think of these rules as filters for enforcement. The first filter of integration seeks to determine whether the written agreement was intended to exclude all prior or contemporaneous oral understandings. That's the issue in Mitchell and Masterson. Parties most commonly use a merger clause to express their intention to exclude any unwritten terms from their agreement. Recall the litigation settlement in Chiaramella, for example, which contained a merger clause, as have many other contracts we've read in prior cases. The second filter of consistency protects the parties' writing. It prevents attempts to prove oral agreements that contradict or are inconsistent with the writing. This is the issue on which the Hunt Foods and Snyder opinions disagree so sharply. These two tests are interrelated and ultimately seek to vindicate the same underlying policy concerns. How much should we protect the text of the written agreement from alteration or addition on the basis of contextual evidence? As you read, the judicial approach to Parol evidence has evolved from the restrictive four corners test to the modern restatement and UCC rules that take a far more permissive approach to contextual evidence. In the second part of this screencast lecture, we'll look more closely at how judges have applied the rule. Thanks for listening.